Okay, we're going to continue in our survey of the Old Testament. This morning we'll be looking at the book of Exodus. Again, these are big picture flyovers of the whole book. I think there's a real benefit to doing that. You can always dig in deeper yourselves to individual passages. But we want to try to get the big picture, not only of each individual Bible book, but of the storyline as it runs through the Old Testament. The date of the events of the book of Exodus, it starts with Israel's entrance into Egypt in approximately 1875 BC and concludes with the building of the tabernacle in about 1445 BC. 1445 BC is also a commonly accepted date of the Exodus. Structure, outline of the book, we're going to look at it as two major parts. The first of these is from Egypt to Mount Sinai in chapters 1 through 18. Remember, these books, particularly the first 5 books of the Pentateuch, one book just picks right up where the earlier book left off. So I want us to read a little bit out of chapter 1. Remember, chapter 50 of Genesis ends with Joseph dying, with Jacob's family being down in Egypt. And here's where it picks up now in Exodus chapter 1. These are the names of the sons of Israel, Israel being another name for Jacob, who came to Egypt with Jacob. They came each one with his household: Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad, and Asher. Those are the 12 tribes. Remember that Jacob, or Israel, had those 12 sons by 4 different women. And all the persons who came from the loins of Jacob were 70 in number. That's how many people end up down in Egypt. But Joseph was already in Egypt. And Joseph died, and all his brothers, and all that generation. So we're getting some passage of time here. But the sons of Israel were fruitful, and increased greatly, and multiplied, and became exceedingly mighty, so that the land was filled with them. Now, when you hear that, what do you think of? The fact that the nation multiplied and the whole land was filled with them.
It's like the Abrahamic covenant.
It's the Abrahamic covenant. It's God fulfilling the promises that he made to make a great nation. First of Abraham, confirmed to Isaac, confirmed to Jacob. He's doing exactly what he said he would. Now a new king arose over Egypt who did not know Joseph. Remember, the original Pharaoh, Joseph, was raised up and did a great job for him in taking care of the grain and distributing the grain during the course of the 7 years of famine. He was very favored by the Pharaoh, and that's what enabled him to be able to bring his family down in Egypt in the first place. But this new king comes to Egypt, this new Pharaoh. He didn't know Joseph. I don't think that necessarily means he had no idea who he was, but he didn't have the kind of relationship with him that the other king did. And he said to his people, "Behold, the people of the sons of Israel are more and mightier than we. Come, let us deal wisely with them, lest they multiply, and in the event of war, they also join themselves to those who hate us, and fight against us, and depart from the land." So it goes on to describe how they appointed taskmasters for them, they made their labors very difficult, and they subjected them to bondage. Now, what does that remind you of?
Is it
Genesis 15.
Okay, it's another part of the Abrahamic covenant. Genesis 15, God said ahead of time that they would be enslaved for a period of 400 years. Well, that's what's beginning here in Egypt in Exodus chapter 1. So we have that description of the growth of Israel in chapter 1. Chapters 2 through 6 are the call of Moses. Now, Moses, of course, is a very key figure in Israel's history. We know that Abraham is the father of the nation. Moses, though, is the one who really is the first mediator between God and the nation of Israel. It's more individual in the book of Genesis with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Now there's this great multitude of people, and Moses is going to be the one that's going to be their leader. What do we know about Moses?
Tribe of Levi?
Okay, he's from the tribe of Levi. What was the circumstances of his birth?
He was safe from being killed.
He was safe from being killed, and why was he under threat to be killed?
Pharaoh's killing the firstborn.
Pharaoh's killing the firstborn, even all the male children, and he's trying to get the midwives to kill any male children that are born to the Israelites. Of course, they don't comply, and that's a good thing. But Moses is put out in the water. He's watched over by a nurse, but he ends up in the house of Pharaoh, and he's raised in that house. In fact, he spends 40 years there. He gets exposed to all the learning of Egypt. Now that's going to be providential and important, because he's going to be the one that goes back to Pharaoh and says, "Let my people go." What is it that got Moses in trouble as he served in the house of Pharaoh? He killed an Egyptian. He saw an Egyptian and an Israelite fighting with each other, kind of looked around, saw nobody was looking, and he killed the Egyptian. How did that come to light?
The Israelite ran away and told everybody else.
Okay, it was actually a different fight. There were two Israelites fighting the next day, and Moses came. He still identified as an Israelite, even though he'd been raised in the house of Pharaoh. He said, "Why are you doing this? You're brothers. Why are you fighting with each other?" And one of those Israelites said, "Who made you judge over us? And are you going to kill me the same way you killed that Egyptian?" Well, at that point, Moses knew that the word was out, and he has to flee. You can divide his life up into 3 periods of 40 years. He is 40 years in being raised up in the house of Pharaoh. He goes from there to the land of Midian, and he spends 40 years there. It's during that time that God calls him through the burning bush and tells him he's the one that's selected to go and lead Israel out of Egyptian bondage. And then he does that for a period of 40 years. Remember, they end up wandering in the wilderness for a total of 40 years. So he's 120 years old when he dies. Very important figure in Israel's history. All right, we have in chapters 7 through 10 the 10 plagues. Now, yes, please feel free to ask a question at any point.
Does it, I'm always wondering if they were killing all the people because they were Jewish or Israelites, and then they took him into his house, did they not know he was an Israelite for a long time?
I think,
and if so, clearly somebody knew towards the end, because they said, why are you doing this to our people? So
yes.
Clearly at some point he knew that he was.
Yes.
Did everybody else know? And or does that not even matter?
No, I think, and I'd have to go back and read to make my case for this stronger.
Why would they keep him who's Israelites? What I'm wondering. If they
Well,
were trying to kill everybody.
Who was it that found him? Pharaoh's daughter. And I just think she had natural compassion for the child. I think she knew that they were trying to save this child from being killed. She's the one that brought him in. And I think, at that point, because she's basically under the protection of Pharaoh's daughter, she does know that he's an Israelite, but she raises that son as her own.
It's maybe like the Ten Commandments, maybe where it was revealed later in life that she knew that. Have you seen that movie?
I've seen it, and I have to be very careful that I don't let it interpret, because I want to do that.
That's why I was asking, because I think it must have been revealed later, based on seeing that movie, but it doesn't seem like it says.
I thought that in the movie even it was revealed earlier, because I remember they had the blanket in the basket that was the Hebrew clothing, right?
But it seemed like they were hiding it from people till he was older, as well, and then.
Yeah. And I think that part is hard to say. It's hard to say how many people knew it, at least hard to say just from the scriptural account. But I think it's clear that Moses still knew it. I don't think he tried to hide his heritage. And to me, it wouldn't be unusual that once he's taken into the household and raised, they probably thought they could influence him toward their own learning and toward their own worship system. And it didn't seem like that happened. So I think he did know it. I think the other people in the palace knew as well.
Whether from the movie or in an explanation, have you ever heard a good explanation of why she thought putting him in the water was a good way to save him?
I haven't heard a good explanation of that. I think it does say that it got to a point where they couldn't hide him anymore. It almost seems like they're hoping somebody will find him and raise him I mean, he's floating right by where the gal bathed, right? Or where she was out in the river. So I don't know if that was part of the intention. I don't think that's explicit in Scripture, but it seems like they're hoping that maybe some Egyptian would find the baby and raise it. Okay, so we have the call of Moses that goes, oh, I'm sorry, we're at the 10 plagues now. What? Did you have a question?
I did. About the call again. I know the people grumbled against Moses. Did it appear to them at times that he was self-appointed? I mean, because he met every God at the burning bush, by himself. So how did they come to know and recognize him as their leader? What was the process?
Well, I think they did wrestle with that, and even though he told them, he even wrestled with being their leader, and he asked God, well, who shall I tell them sent me? And he tells them, I am. Yahweh is the name of the Lord. And so I think the main reason they rebel against Moses, and they do it frequently through Exodus and through Numbers, is that they don't like the way things are going. And he doesn't even get down from the mountain good with the law until they've already made the golden calf and the worshiping. I mean, you couldn't get them more explicit. That's after they had agreed to be faithful to the Lord. So, yeah, I think the fact that, it wasn't like the Lord appeared to all of them and said, Moses is your guy. He appeared to Moses, he sent Moses and Aaron, and they just wrestled with him being the leader, largely because their circumstances were difficult at times. Remember when Moses first tells Pharaoh to let them go, they refuse, and they make the labor for the people even harder. So Moses seems like he's making things worse for them instead of better. They get out in the wilderness initially, and they say, we're going to die from hunger out here. There's nothing to eat out here. We wish we were back in Egypt. That's a real insult to the Lord, after God had done all these things to deliver them, and yet they're very ungrateful. So it's a long explanation to a short question, but does that answer?
Yes, and this, you don't have to answer all this next part, but do you think there's any connection between why I'm trying to say, the appointment of Joshua was a little more public?
I don't know that you could say, I think the difference there would be they knew Joshua, they knew he had been assistant to Moses. There's a lot of things that are similar in the call of Joshua as there was to Moses. Joshua was very successful. I mean, under his leadership, what were they doing? They were conquering peoples. They weren't having the same kind of trek through the wilderness that they were with Moses and facing the same difficulty. I think in the case of Moses, God was testing Israel. He wanted that trek to be difficult because he wanted them to learn to trust him. And yet they really didn't. I mean, a whole generation did.
I think Moses was accredited to the people by the sign miracles.
Yes.
Just like Christ and the apostles were accredited by sign miracles. So I think the people knew because of those 10 plagues.
That's right.
The sign miracles.
That's right.
And turning the Nile into blood.
Right. And Moses even talked about that when he was just with the Lord himself, right? He kind of wondered, well, how will they know that I'm supposed to be the one? And God gave him those miracles. Mm-hmm. He demonstrated that power right then, and then he ended up, that's right. So he ended up going on to do it. So to me, they didn't have a good reason for not trusting Moses' leadership, but they still rebelled against it. Mm-hmm. Even Aaron and Miriam rebelled against it. And it's going to be an ongoing theme for the nation of Israel, despite all these things and these great demonstrations of power that God has done. They're very fickle, and
even Moses himself was fickle.
He was fickle in the sense. I mean, he struck the rock instead of speaking to it, and he did it kind of, I think, out of anger towards the people. But if you look at his overall record, I mean, he's the one that intercedes for Israel when God is ready to wipe them out.
That's true.
And, God could have done that. He could have wiped Israel out and brought a new generation through Moses and his family and still stayed faithful to his covenants. But because of Moses' intercession, the Lord changed his mind, that's what it says, and didn't kill the people. Okay, it's good questions, good observations. But the 10 plagues, we'll talk about this more in a little bit. I want you to begin now to think about what were the purposes of those plagues. I think there were several. We already hinted at it a little bit because they were a demonstration of God's power. But I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. And then we have the Exodus and journey from Egypt down to Sinai in chapters 13 through 18. Now, we looked at that a little bit already when we looked at the overview of the Pentateuch as a whole. But I want to use that same map that we used before and just see the key events that take place during that journey. It's about 3 months from the land of Goshen down to Mount Sinai. All right, the second division then, that's chapters 1 through 18. The second division is 19 through 40. It all takes place down at Sinai. The first part of that is the very important Mosaic covenant from Exodus 19 and 24. Again, we're benefiting because we've had that study of the covenants already. So we've talked about the Mosaic covenant a lot. But this was a very important part of the history of Israel. God's entering into the covenant not with an individual, but with the whole nation. He's laying out what he promises to do for them as their God and what their obligations are to him as his people. So 19 through 24 is a very key part of Israel's history. Then in 25 to 31, we have preparations for the construction of the tabernacle. A lot of the book of Exodus deals with that. First you have this description, and you have these gifted men, Bezalel and Aholiab, who are gifted for making these things. You have people that bring not just money, but different kinds of fabrics that are involved in making the tabernacle. You have all these plans that are made. You have some mention of the feast as well. All that is preparation for the construction of the tabernacle. And then while Moses is up with the Lord, you have this incident of the golden calf. And again, that kind of foreshadows Israel's rebellion that's going to continue to happen over the course of their history. You remember what took place there. They basically are tired of waiting on Moses. They don't know what's happened to him. And they're saying, make us a God that we can see. And Aaron, of all people, they bring their gold, and he is able to mold it into this golden calf. And he says, behold, your gods that brought you out of the land of Egypt. Now, on the one hand, you think, how in the world could he do something like that? On the other hand, remember, they've been in Egypt for 400 years. This is what they've been surrounded with for most of their time. And now they're going back there.
They had also brought out some idol worship stuff.
Yeah, I'm sure.
Them, what it was called, something of Rapham, and that was the child sacrifice. You know,
yes, and that's something.
That they did child sacrifice.
That's right, and that's something they'll do again later. But you know, Aaron was part of kind of the face-to-face with God that Moses had, and he did that, and then when Moses comes down and confronts Aaron about it, what does he say? Well, I threw this stuff in there, and out came this idol. It's like he doesn't even want to take responsibility for it. So, again, it's a very tough time for the nation of Israel. A lot of people die as a result of that rebellion, but God, and again, God's ready to wipe the whole nation out at that point. But Moses intercedes, and again, we see some insight into the character of Moses here. Despite the great difficulty that this people is causing, and think about it, this is over 2 million people that he's trying to lead out of Egypt down to Mount Sinai. Very, very difficult thing to do. But despite the grumbling and the rebellion against him and his leadership, he loves this people. He recognizes that God is the one that has multiplied them. And remember the argument that he makes when he's interacting and interceding for the people with God about asking them not to destroy the people? What does he say?
His reputation.
God's reputation is at stake here. Look, what are the Egyptians going to say? You made this great people for yourself and you brought them out in the wilderness to wipe them out. Just don't do that. And Moses is very vigorous in his defense of Israel. And it works. Now again, you have to kind of think, well, is God doing what Moses wanted him to do? I think prayer it's real, and I think it's almost as if God is asking Moses to intercede when he says, "Step back and let me wipe these people out." But Moses does, and again, the appeal that Moses makes, based on the character of God and his own reputation, is one that says, "Okay, I'm willing to relent, but they're going to pay the price too eventually."
Yeah.
Kylie?
Why did Aaron make the golden calf?
Why did he make it? I think he made it, one, because Moses wasn't there. He was away at that time, and Moses was the one that really recognized how wrong that was. And just the pressure of the people. That's what they were asking for, was an idol that they could see and worship. That's not an excuse. It was wrong for him to do it. But I think that kind of is why.
The people were a handful.
They were. They were absolutely were.
You said they were what?
They were a handful. I mean, they were rebels. And we're going to see that very clearly, not just in Exodus, but as we continue into the book of Numbers. Moses documents their rebellion very carefully. And again, we see that through the rest of Israel's history, and we see God's grace and mercy and compassion towards Israel despite the fact that they were such a handful.
Is there any way that we can know how much the people knew about the God of Israel? I mean, at this time they were probably raised on pagan gods.
They were.
And then all of a sudden, they're painting, lamb's blood above their door, and they're being spared. Are they understanding that is Moses telling all the people that this is the real God? I mean, what kind of
well, think about it. What was it that they saw that should have made them should have made it clear the God that was protecting them?
Parting of the Red Sea?
Well, even before that.
Okay. I mean, the plagues.
The plagues themselves. Yeah. I mean, there were 10 very strong displays of power. The first couple affected them as well as the Egyptians, but after the first couple of plagues, they were only hitting the Egyptians, and the Israelites were spared from these things. So they should have known from that God's great care for them and the great power that he was, and the fact that he was doing things that the gods of Egypt could not do.
Right.
So after that, you have the deliverance at the Red Sea. You have God's provision for them as they trek down to Mount Sinai. You have God granting them victory over the Amalekites. So that's what makes their rebellion particularly heinous in my mind, is they had very clear demonstrations of God and his power and his great love for them.
I mean, do you think it was like a direct rebellion, as far as like they knew who God was, yet they were going to do their own thing? Or they were trying to just make an image of God in the calf? Or were they just trying to say, okay, well, this is the God that's doing it all for us, and they just didn't recognize that it was, Yahweh, or,
Well, I do think they should have recognized, based on what God had done,
right,
that this was Yahweh. And they're getting instruction from Moses too. Remember, they're making that golden calf after Moses has come down the first time and after they have agreed to obey God.
I guess during that time too, while they're doing the golden calf thing, there's like that big storm around.
Yes, that's part of it. It's part of the great power of God, is that he comes down in a theophany of thunder and lightning and fire. And again, that was just one demonstration of who he was. So I think they're without excuse. It's true that their time in Egypt did influence them. And I do think that once Moses had left and had been away as long as he had, 40 days, they're thinking, we're out here by ourselves. We don't have anything to eat. They grumbled more than anything because of their circumstances. And what God wanted them to learn to do was to trust him despite difficult circumstances. It's true that their circumstances were very difficult on one hand, but God had promised to provide for them, and he was already showing that he would do that, and they still rebelled. He did.
I also think that, the Lord always has a remnant. Wherever they are.
That's right.
He's always got a remnant, and he's always got ones who believe. And I believe that they had the oral tradition of what the promise was to Abraham.
They did.
They had all of that.
That's right.
So when Moses came and he started doing all these things, they knew this is the God of Israel.
That's
This is
right.
our God.
That's right.
And so that's why a lot of them did the blood on the door, because they said, this is our God
Right.
who's come to get us.
Right.
And they saw all of those things being done, even though, you know, just like our hearts can go back, you know, oh, maybe it's not, you know, even John the Baptist said, you know, send me word, is this
Yeah.
him? That,
Yeah.
you know,
And it was the same kind of thing in his case. He's looking and thinking, okay, I know that when the Messiah comes, he's going to restore Israel to their former glory. And why am I in prison? And if he's the Messiah, why isn't all those things happening that we read about in the Old Testament prophets?
and then also the majority were not believing, per se, at, you know, in the time in the wilderness.
Right.
But, and then also it's hard when that flood is coming at you, you're going against the grain.
Yep.
It's hard for you to stay strong.
It
And
is.
that's why, you know, it helps to have people around you that, you know, that can build you up. But, I mean, in that time, Aaron was going against the grain.
That's right.
Just like with Daniel and his friends.
Yes.
You know.
That's a good point about the remnant in particular. You know, the straw that breaks the camel's back is when they send the spies up, and only 2 of them come back and say that they can take the land. So it is a minority through that period of time. It's not like today. I mean, like you said, God always has a remnant. It's always a minority of people until we get to the millennial kingdom. And then, you know, at least at the beginning, everybody knows the Lord, and the knowledge of Him is spread all over the earth. He's actually on the earth ruling. But even then, just to show you the depravity of man, at the end of that 1,000 years, there's a huge rebellion. So we're really not safe till we get to the eternal state as far as everybody believing and not being tempted. You know, we have to be careful not to judge the Israelites too quickly, because we do the same thing. You know, we think about all that God has done for us, and why would we doubt, or why would we disobey? And yet we do. We still struggle with sin. So, okay.
It says at one point, I'm sorry.
Go ahead. You go ahead.
I was just saying, it's saying at one point they were looking at the storm in absolute fear for
Yes.
their lives. They were
That's right.
actually fearful for their lives. So, I mean, do you think that they were thinking some kind of judgment, or, you know, all that kind of stuff?
Well, I think that God purposely appeared that way because He wanted them to fear. He wanted them to have a right kind of fear for Him. And again, He's already made clear His power through the plagues themselves. But now He wants them to know. And we think of fear as a bad thing. The Bible doesn't look at it that way. It's a great motivator. And fear in a good sense. Now, we don't fear God now, for those of us that know Christ, because we know He's not going to judge us for our sin. But we're still to have the fear of the Lord that's talked about so much in the book of Proverbs and even in the epistles. There's a right kind of fear of God, and I think He appears the way He does on the mountain to inculcate that in His people.
Even if you touch the mountain, you die.
That's right. God laid out the boundaries and said, look, I'm holy, you're not. You've got to obey. I think that's a big part of His point, is to the need for them to recognize who He is and to obey His word. That's what was going to bring their blessing. Okay, Charles, and then...
I was going to say, Ryrie defined fear of God as reverence for God expressed in submission to His will.
Exactly. I mean, when they do that, there's no trouble. You know, and when we do that, there's no trouble. Now, that might bring still difficult circumstances for us. We could be put in a position today where we have to obey God, and it could cost us our lives. In fact, there's many places in the world today where Christians die because they love the Lord. But what happens? I mean, we go to a better place at that point. So there's no reason for us to fear anything that happens in this life. We need to fear the Lord, and that's going to manifest itself through reverence and obedience to His word, as Charles said.
I'm just going to say about the holiness of God He's showing. He was showing them even during the time that he was going to give them his law, how he was going to set them apart as a people.
Right.
He is set apart. So he's saying, as I am holy, you be holy.
That's right.
You
Yeah.
know, so he's showing them, you are going, this, what I'm about to give you is going to set you apart from the rest of the nation.
Exactly.
Don't do as they do.
Exactly.
Do what I said to do.
That's right. And he talked to Moses already at the burning bush. You know, that appearance was also to emphasize his holiness. And I mean, that's just a major theme of the book, is the holiness of God and the fact that he's making Israel a holy people so that the nations can see their God, see Israel's God through Israel themselves. All right, the last section from 35 to 40 involves the construction of the tabernacle itself while they're at Mount Sinai. So as you can see, the tabernacle is a major thing in the book of Exodus.
It's a real fun read.
Yeah, if you're a builder or something, it's very detailed.
I wish somebody would make a video or program that as you're reading it, it constructs it all for you as
Yeah.
you're reading it.
So
I think that'd be really cool.
I've got maybe not a close second
But
to
you know,
that,
they
but a
have
second.
pictures of it.
I got
want to see it,
pictures.
like as you're reading it, oh, here the wall goes up.
Yeah.
And it's this long, and I don't know.
Yeah.
Sounds like your next project.
Well, and speaking about that, it's so awesome how God, when he does construct it, how there's so much symbolism as to how, you know, the curtain separates, you know,
Yeah.
people from God, and yet God's always telling you, no, if you're with me, this place is holy, you're separate from that.
That's right.
And
That's another.
There's so much symbolism in the temple itself.
The tabernacle itself is another emphasis of holiness. The separateness of God on the one hand, the fact that he has to be approached in the way that he prescribes, and again, even the sacrificial system was designed to cleanse them from impurity. Okay, let's keep going. So here's that map again that I was talking about that we looked at before, but they start out here in the land of Goshen in Egypt after the 10 plagues and after the Passover as the last of those plagues. They set out from there and make their way down and cross the Red Sea. Remember, Pharaoh changes his mind and says, what have I done? I've released this huge labor force that I have basically free of charge. What in the world am I doing? You know, so he goes after them in the army, with the army. And you can imagine at this point the people are scared to death. They're pinned against the Red Sea. They again are afraid that Moses had brought them out so that they would die in the wilderness, and they would rather have died in Egypt. But God again does a supernatural thing in not only drying up the ground so that 2 million people could cross it, and stopping the Egyptian army from being able to get there initially, and then once they got into the Red Sea, the army themselves, God destroyed the entire army. It's a tremendous display of God's power. So again, you would think, well, at that point, the people would say, there's nothing our God can't do. There's nothing that he's not going to do to protect us and provide for us. They don't say that. And that becomes clear as we continue down on the journey down to Sinai. They come to a place called Marah, where the waters were bitter. As you can imagine, food and water were a major concern as they're making this trek over a period of 3 months. But they were able to make the water sweet there, so that there's a place for them to have water. God's providing for them all along the way. They come to a place called Elim, where there was a natural oasis, and they're able to refresh themselves there. As they continue to make their way down, they come to a point where God starts providing manna in the wilderness. Again, they're thinking, there's no way we can make it out here. We're getting hungry, there's nothing to eat. God provides this supernatural bread from heaven. He also provides quail for them in chapter 16. He begins to train them and say, look, for 6 days, you go out and collect this food. On the 7th day, there's not going to be any out there, and you don't need to go out there. I'll bring enough on the 6th day to last you through the 7th. He also said, I'm going to provide for you day by day. You just eat what's provided that day. Don't try to save it. Why would he not want them to save it?
Just so they can rely on him.
Exactly. He wants them to trust him for day by day provision of their daily bread. Well, as we read there in Exodus 16, they don't do that. There's some that saved it to the next day, and it grew foul and had worms in it. Again, it's an object lesson more than anything. There were also some people that went out on the seventh day to try to find it, and they weren't supposed to do that. So, again, we get, on the one hand, you can understand it's 2 million people. Not everybody's going to do it lockstep like they're supposed to.
Quick question: At this time, is the tabernacle built?
It's not.
Okay.
They're not going to start building on it until they get down to Sinai.
Okay.
There's also water that's provided from the rock, and there's victory over the Amalekites. This was the place where Moses had to hold his hands up, and as long as he had them held up, they would have victory. And what happened when that was the case? What's that?
They would lose if you put them down.
Okay, and who had to help him?
Aaron and Joshua.
Aaron and Joshua had to help hold his arms up so that they would have victory over the Amalekites. And then finally they get down to Mount Sinai. And of course, this is the place, this area was the same place where God had appeared to Moses initially at the burning bush. Midian is this land over here where he had tended flocks for 40 years. But he's there at Mount Sinai. God appears to them in that awful theophany, awful in the sense of great power, but darkness and lightning and flashes of thunder. And it's at that point that they receive the law and that they receive the instruction about building the tabernacle, and they actually build the tabernacle. And that's where the book of Exodus ends, is with the construction of the tabernacle. All right, this is not a video, and it doesn't go into the actual detail, but it does help, I think, to see a picture like this. You have just the tabernacle layout itself and the outer court here. They included the altar for offering sacrifices, and the laver over here is where they wash the animals before they offer them on the altar. And then you have the inner makeup of the tent itself. The holy place was the first place that a priest would come into. It included what's called the table of the presence, or the table of showbread, and part of the priest's function was to swap that bread out on a regular basis. But it was like we have bread as a symbol of the Lord's Supper. This was a symbol of the Lord's presence with them, and I think also of His provision for food for them. You had the 7-branch candelabra there that would not only provide light itself for inside the tent, but I think there is some symbolism there as Israel being a light to the nations. You had the altar of incense that was also part of this outer room, the holy place, and that was another thing that the priest maintained. And the incense, again, was something that was an offering up to God, a sweet-smelling aroma to Him. Inside this place, the Holy of Holies, was the Ark of the Covenant, made out of acacia wood, overlaid with gold. It's going to contain the tablets of the testimony that God receives from Moses. Only the high priest goes into that area, and only once a year, to make atonement for the sins of the people. And as you see the Shekinah glory in the cloud by day and the pillar of fire by night, it's over the top of the what's called the mercy seat there. Those are the 2 angelic seraphim on top of the mercy seat.
Did it actually come up out of it like that picture? Because I always just pictured it as like hovering over it.
Did what come up out of it? The cloud?
Smoke and the fire and stuff.
Yeah, I think it was I would see it as a big pillar of cloud that everybody could see during the
Do
day.
you think it came up out of the thing like that?
Well, I think
picture?
it.
'Cause I would just picture it as above it, not coming out. You see the pictures
You would
coming
think
Yeah.
the fire would
Yeah.
come out, right? Because that would be.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's all I'm asking is probably not.
I don't know, it probably wasn't coming out of it down to the point here, but I guess, I don't know if it was, it seemed like that is the location of it, is right there, at least when the tabernacle is set up. Now, when they get ready to move, that pillar of cloud is moving and leading them, and the tabernacle is in transport at that point.
How long was just a quick question, how long was the journey supposed to be from Egypt to the Promised Land?
That's a good question. It wasn't nearly supposed to be 40 years. They end up having to reroute for different reasons at different times. But I would think that if they had been obedient, they had gone up and spied out the land and gone directly up to the Promised Land, something less than a year. They end up having to wander for 40 years because of their disobedience. God's basically making them wander in the wilderness so that they die out. except for Joshua. And
I mean, it would have to be like gross disobedience, right? Because I mean, everyone's going to be disobedient to some extent.
Well, it was gross disobedience in the sense that it was a series of acts of disobedience, and it culminated almost every time they said they wanted to go back to Egypt. And it really was kind of an in-your-face rebellion against God. And as I said before, the straw that broke the camel's back was when they sent the spies up there, they saw that the land was just as it had been described. It was a beautiful land, very fruitful and productive. And everybody agreed on that, but only 2 said that they could take the land. Everybody else was afraid. And again, you have to put it in the context of all that God had done for them up to that point.
Yeah.
So it was a tremendous level of rebellion.
That was when they had finally made it to the land, right?
Well, they hadn't gotten to the land yet, and I'll show you when we get to the book of Numbers, but that was over kind of south and west of the land, and at that point is when they start having to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. But they weren't even up in the plains of Moab like they would be in the book of Deuteronomy yet. They were at Kadesh Barnea, where they sent the spies up into the land and saw it, and they came back and reported to the people, and it's at that point that they had to start wandering.
I think it was a mixture of doubting God and direct idolatry that was the main factor, because they doubted God, and then you're not doing the job that you're supposed to be doing. We're not supposed to be out here with, we back in Egypt, we were just living, great or whatever. But also, when Korah and the rebellion of Korah, they were doubting God's choice of Moses.
Yes.
And I mean, it was just a series of things about them doubting God.
Yeah.
And it really is idolatry, but I mean, that's part of idolatry.
Yeah.
And then also they wanted the other gods.
Yeah. I mean, you think about it too, though. They kept saying they wanted to go back to Egypt. Their lives in Egypt were miserable.
Right.
Yeah. And they so quickly forgot that.
Right.
Now, again, I don't mean to diminish how difficult it was to travel through this period. But this is what God had ordained for them. God had made himself known to them in many ways. And for them to continue to grumble against him, to grumble against Moses, even Aaron and Miriam grumbling against Moses, it was as if they just weren't paying attention.
Sounds like they just let all the old generation that lived in Egypt just die off, and the kids that were raised in this kind of atmosphere, they probably were the ones that trusted in Saul, and they didn't know how it was before.
That is what happened. The only exception to that, Joshua and Caleb were part of the original generation. They didn't die, but they did allow all the ones that came out of Egypt passed away, other than those 2, and their children are the ones that end up there. Okay, you also have in the book of Exodus a description of the priest and the priestly garments. Remember, Levi is the broad tribe that the Levites come from, and some of those are just tasked with taking care of the tabernacle and transporting it. But the priests are a subdivision of the tribe of Levi, and they are the ones who go inside to the holy place and the Holy of Holies. The high priest wears this garment. I think that's just the high priest and not priest in general. He has 12 stones on his breastplate, each one engraved with one of the names of the tribes of Israel. He also has the shoulder stones. We have 6 on one side and 6 on the other that also have those names in them. And again, there's prescription there of how they're to conduct themselves, how they're to be purified, and how they're to make atonement for the people. All right? Let's just talk about then some major themes of the book of Exodus. And you've already touched on some of these as we've gone along. But just call out the ones that you think about. What are the major themes of this book? Tabernacle takes up a lot of ink. And that's what we mean by major themes. Either something that takes up a lot of space or something that's repeated on a regular basis.
You're talking about the latter half?
The whole book.
The plagues.
The plagues. Deliverance.
The law.
the law, the Mosaic covenant, huge part of this book. Somebody else mentioned one earlier relating to holiness. Holiness both for God and for his people. Okay, that's good. You guys are doing well. So, redemption and deliverance, the name of God. When Moses said, who shall I say sends me to this people? And God says, I am who I am. It's a great name for God because it just speaks to his eternality. I think it speaks to his power. But Yahweh is the Hebrew name for the God of Israel. He demonstrates his power through the plagues on Egypt. He also demonstrates on numerous occasions his compassion for the people of Israel on the way down to Sinai. His faithfulness in accomplishing his word, which he had promised as part of the covenants back in Genesis. Knowledge of Yahweh is the main thing that he's trying to do here. This is, I want to read Exodus 9:13 through 16. This is before the 7th plague. The Lord said to Moses, rise up early in the morning and stand before Pharaoh and say to him, thus says the Lord, the God of the Hebrews, let my people go that they may serve me. For this time I will send all my plagues on you and your servants and your people, so that you may know that there is no one like me in all the earth. That's what God is doing as much as anything, is making himself known, not just to Israel, but to all the other nations. For if by now I had put forth my hand and struck you and your people with pestilence, you would have been cut off from the earth. But indeed, for this case I have allowed you to remain, in order to show you my power, and in order to proclaim my name through all the earth. You have the fear of Yahweh. Again, we talked about that already. It was inculcated by the way that he appeared on the mountain. He says, Moses speaking to Pharaoh in Exodus 9:30 says, but as for you and your servants, I know that you do not yet fear the Lord God. And then again in Exodus 14, thus the Lord saved Israel that day from the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. This is after he had delivered them through the Red Sea. And when Israel saw the great power which the Lord had used against the Egyptians, the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. So they would have these times where they recognized God and they believed in Moses, but it seemed like it was short-lived. Moses, we talked about as a major character, as the leader of the people. Holiness. Moses at the burning bush. God talked about his holiness there when he first appeared to Moses. Israel's obligation in the Mosaic covenant. We've talked a lot about the fact that they were to be a chosen race and a holy people. The very layout of the tabernacle itself emphasized the holiness of God. The fact that there were areas that no one but the priest could go. And that the priest made intercession for the people. That just was a way of, on the one hand, showing that God was separate and distinct, and also that they had to approach him in the way that he prescribed. And that's going to be a major theme of the book of Leviticus as well. The covenants, not just the Mosaic covenant, but we already talked about the references or the allusions back to the Abrahamic covenant. The Mosaic covenant, of course, is a major part of the book of Exodus, Israel's obligations there. The tabernacle and its furnishings we already talked about. The hardening of Pharaoh's heart. Now this is fascinating to me. You have on the one hand Pharaoh hardening his own heart against God. On the other hand, you have God hardening Pharaoh's heart. Let me read a couple of these. Exodus 8:15. This is after the second plague of frogs. When Pharaoh saw that there was relief from the frogs, he hardened his heart and did not listen to them, as the Lord had said. Exodus 8:32, after the fourth plague of insects, Pharaoh hardened his heart this time also and did not let the people go. And then one more in Exodus 9:34. When Pharaoh saw that the rain and the hail and the thunder had ceased, he sinned again and hardened his heart, he and his servants. But it also references in Exodus 10, 11, and 14 where God hardened Pharaoh's heart. Now, why would he do that?
bring about his own purpose.
To bring about his own purpose, to bring more plagues, to demonstrate his own power, his own sovereignty. Now, in every case, Pharaoh is still responsible. He's hardening his heart, but God is, at a certain point, God's saying, okay, if this is the way you want to be, I'm going to really harden your heart, and I'm going to bring judgments, further judgments upon you. And what were the purposes of the plagues?
Display God's power.
Display God's power. He says that in Exodus 7. I will harden Pharaoh's heart that I may multiply my signs and my wonders in the land of Egypt. When Pharaoh will not listen to you, then I will lay my hand on Egypt and bring out my host, my people, the sons of Israel, from the land of Egypt by great judgments.
Romans 9 kind of goes into detail about that as well.
It does. It refers back to this incident. The Egyptians shall know that I am the Lord when I stretch out my hand on Egypt and bring out the sons of Israel from their midst. Is there another purpose of the plague that had to do with their situation in Egypt?
A specific plague, or?
No, it was just the plagues in general and what God is doing as he brings these specific plagues.
It was a contest between the Lord and the Egyptian god.
That's right. He's refuting the gods of Egypt because he's using some of the very things that they were supposed to have power over, and they're powerless to do anything about it. Remember, the first couple of plagues, Pharaoh's magicians were able to duplicate them, but it quickly became clear that Moses and his God were much more powerful. And this is what's alluded to in Exodus 12:12. I'll go through the land of Egypt, this is with regards to the Passover, on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. So God's not only making himself known, he's refuting the false gods of the Egyptians. All right, we talked about trying to summarize the message of the whole book. Yahweh, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, has redeemed the sons of Israel from Egyptian bondage and entered into a covenant with the nation at Sinai. That really is a pretty good summary of what's contained in the book of Exodus. All right, because we've already done the Mosaic covenant, I'll just blow through these really quickly. These are all things that we have talked about before. This is just the format of Exodus 19 through 24. The fact that it matches up with other covenants between nations and nations that were conquered. It's called a suzerain vassal treaty. It has a historical prologue, a preamble, stipulations, a provision for reading the covenant on a regular basis, and blessings and curses that line up with either obedience or disobedience. The key passage is Exodus 19, 1-6. The first 4 verses, remember, this is after they've made this trek down to Sinai. They provide the basis of the relationship between Yahweh and Israel, and he's basically just reviewing his choosing of Israel, his bringing them safely through the wilderness, and his entering into covenant with them now. And then verses 5 and 6 provide the purpose and function of that relationship. Now then, if you'll obey my voice and keep my covenant, then you shall be my own possession among all the peoples, for all the earth is mine. You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words that you shall say to the sons of Israel. We've talked about this before. God, as Adia was talking about earlier, Israel is God's special possession. He's going to be the means of blessing for the other nations as they recognize that Israel's God is the true God. They're a kingdom of priests, and they represent the true God to the other nations. They're a holy nation, meaning that they're set apart. Adia was talking about this as well. The fact that the law and the stipulations of the law was going to set them apart from all the other nations. That was a way for them to be holy. That's what the word means, is to be set apart and to reflect the character of God. Here, this is the last slide, and we talked about this a lot, how these covenants work together. And we're starting to see that as we work our way through the Old Testament. The Mosaic covenant, it was the constitution of the nation, and it was the document that regulated the relationship between God and Israel. It was also the means by which the Abrahamic promises of the Abrahamic covenant were fulfilled. we're seeing that God's doing what He promised in the Abrahamic covenant, in both multiplying the people, bringing them into a period of Egyptian bondage, and then bringing them out after 400 years of bondage. As we get later into the Pentateuch, we'll see that the Deuteronomic covenant is a renewal of this same Mosaic covenant with that new generation, with the sons and daughters that were born during the wilderness wandering. And then we have in the Davidic covenant really a pledge or an obligation by the king of the nation to lead the people in keeping the Mosaic covenant. The new covenant also reflects back on this covenant, and that the law of God, the very covenant stipulations that He first laid out for them at Mount Sinai, is now going to be written on their hearts. And their inclination, in spite of all this rebellion that we're reading about as we read through the Old Testament, their future inclination will be to obey. Not just a remnant, but all the nation. I'm going to skip that one. So next time we'll be in the book of Leviticus. Leviticus, we don't have movement like we did in the book of Exodus. It all takes place down there at Sinai. We get more detail about the sacrificial system and the offerings, the feast, all the different, it's really kind of spelling out some detail that He's already provided for in Exodus 19 through 24. If you have a chance between now and then, I would tell you to read Leviticus. I'm not sure how many of you would do that between now and then. At least skim through it and kind of get the big picture of what it looks like. And read Ben Ware's book. You have access to that because it'll help you see again what the outline and major themes are. Okay, any other questions? It was a really good discussion this morning. And I want this second hour to be that way, for you to ask questions and contribute and learn. Let's learn together.